This is the Coast Business Radio podcast.
Hello, I'm Mike Ryan, and thanks for joining us. My grandmother always told me to be careful of her china. Wise words, and even though she was talking about plates, cups, and soup bowls, we really do need to be careful of China, a wonderful country with so much history and beautiful people. What is ugly is the Chinese Communist Party. And we are now seeing the ugly side of the Chinese ruling class. That's the Chinese Communist Party. China's ambassador to Sweden, speaking on Swedish public radio, said, "We treat our friends with fine wine, but for our enemies, we got shotguns." Ominous words are most definitely a warning from the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, it's fine wine for the Andrews Victorian government, and a shotgun for the rest of us. Today we have 6 fabulous conversations that are part of the Chinese web, from trade to national security to tourism to military might to individual freedom. And speaking of freedom, we also talk border closures and the underappreciation of the economic disaster facing Queensland's tourism industry. Today our guests include Salvatore Babones from the Centre for Independent Studies, who says that China won't be getting an easy ride anytime soon.
People around the world are now starting to realize that a fish stinks in Denmark, except it's not Denmark, it's Beijing. And I really don't think China will get as easy a ride in the future.
George Christensen MP, federal member for Dawson, Queensland, and chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth, says we need to disentangle ourselves from China.
While they are behaving so erratically, they really aren't really a trusted trading partner because they pull these economic threats all the time.
When it comes to China, we need to push back hard. That's according to Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute.
There is a growing debate within Australia's strategic policy community, of which I'm a member, about how we deal with our relations with China. Some are advocating that we simply accommodate and acquiesce to China's interests and not rock the boat. Others are saying we should push back hard, and certainly I fall into that latter camp.
The Queensland Premier believes September was a far more likely option to open the border, but Daniel Gschwind, CEO of the Queensland Tourism Industry Council, says that the Queensland Government should stick to the plan and open the borders in July.
We see no reason why the Queensland Government would divert from this plan and keep the borders closed, and we certainly encourage them daily to, as I said, stick to the plan, and so we fully anticipate there is still a real prospect that the borders will open in July.
The Epoch Times has run a very strong editorial. To resist the Chinese Communist Party virus, say no to the CCP. We're joined by the China correspondent for the Epoch Times, Daniel Teng.
Chinese Communist Party is very overt. People talk actively and openly about its use of hostility.
Phil Honeywood, CEO of the International Education Association of Australia, says that our reliance on China is no different to other Australian industries.
Yes, we do rely on China, but then look, so does our iron ore industry, so does our coal industry. So we're not unusual there as an industry that's been reliant on China.
Finally, don't forget to subscribe. Coming up next, Salvatore Babones.
You're listening to Coast Business Radio with Mike Ryan.
Salvatore Babones holds a Master's in Mathematical Sciences and a PhD in Sociology from the Johns Hopkins University. A proud American by birth, he has lived in Sydney since 2008. Salvatore is a political sociologist at the University of Sydney and an elected member of the National Committee on US-China Relations. His book, The New Authoritarianism, Trump Populism and the Tyranny of Experts, was named Best on Politics 2018 by the Wall Street Journal. Salvatore is also the author or co-author of several books and academic research articles. His research on the global economy has a particular focus on China, including the Belt and Road Initiative, global trade networks, and Australia-China relations. Salvatore is an adjunct scholar at the Centre for Independent Studies. The centre promotes free choice and individual liberty and defends cultural freedom and the open exchange of ideas. Salvatore, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, one of your publications noted in February that China's coronavirus epidemic is likely to cost Australia's export industries. Then it was up to about $12 billion in lost revenues. Seems such a long time ago. What are we looking at now?
Well, that is a long time ago. That was the first week of February. We made those projections. That was for my work at the Centre for Independent Studies here in Sydney. And it was only a projection of lost export revenue for the first half of the year on the assumption that the whole thing would be over by May or June.
Not on a long shot. It's here to stay for a while.
On a long shot. But the estimates turned out to be right on target as far as universities are concerned, because when universities later announced their coronavirus revenue losses, they were bang on what we had said in the paper. And unfortunately, this is going to continue. So, sure, $12 billion for the first half of the year. I think that's probably a reasonable estimate of Australia's lost export revenues. Now, that's nothing compared to Australia's lost GDP, which has turned out to be much, much greater. The real problem for exports, of course, is that services exports will continue at zero for the rest of the year and who knows into 2021. Iron ore has actually outperformed, so a lot of our concerns about a slowdown in Australia's iron exports were completely unfounded. We turned out to be entirely wrong. Throughout the crisis, iron prices have actually risen. Who would have thought? And China is buying more iron ore than it was before the crisis. 2020 is shaping up to be a record year for Australian iron exports.
But who knows? I mean, just today, in the newspaper, or the whisper was that that's going to be on the hit list next, and coal.
Well, we'll see. They're talking a little bit about coal, but of course Andrew Forrest has been so outspoken in favor of China that China has actually taken moves to streamline Australian iron imports, whereas they used to inspect every single shipment of iron ore at customs. They've announced streamlined customs procedures. So who knows? It's really iron ore that's the biggie from an economic standpoint. And China seems to want to let that continue while targeting politically sensitive, but in volume terms, much, much smaller exports of things like beef and wine.
And wine and beef both go together, so we can't have one or the other.
Well, you're talking to a teetotaling vegetarian, so it's nothing to me. But of course, it's a serious problem for Australia's farmers.
Now, universities, they're feeling the pinch. The exposure of these institutions to a slowdown in international student revenues from China must be, for a $40 billion industry, fairly terrifying.
Well, Australia's universities allowed themselves to become extraordinarily dependent on China. I wrote a paper on this back in August 2019 that got a lot of coverage. If you were to make a league table of universities in the world by numbers of Chinese students, outside China, Australia has 7 of the top 10 spots.
Oh my God.
Australia is more dependent on international, but especially on Chinese students than any other university system in the world. And of course, now that has slowed to a trickle. I think it's even worse than what's been reported in the papers, because I don't think they're going to come back. Australia's universities are desperately trying right now to restore the pipeline of Chinese students. They're lobbying for a safe passport, essentially, for students coming from China. Their argument is that China doesn't have coronavirus anymore. We don't have coronavirus anymore. So students should be allowed to come from China in a kind of direct pipeline to Australia starting next semester. I don't think China is going to want to send them.
So where do they go?
Well, China is now facing decades of declining student numbers. And it's a problem for Chinese universities, which are starting to have to close down and repurpose their facilities. They need the kids back home. Now, it would have been politically extremely difficult for China to have told Chinese parents that their kids can't study overseas. Remember, these are middle-class, upper-class parents in China, many of them members of the Communist Party themselves. It would have been politically difficult for the government to cut off international student travel before the coronavirus. Now that the coronavirus has hit and they can cut off student travel on health grounds, I think they'll be able to make that stick. That is, I think that come this August, September, the Chinese government will quite legitimately tell its parents or tell its students that they can't travel to North America and England. Now, North America and the UK will almost certainly still have endemic coronavirus come this northern summer. And I think they'll tell them they can't start the new school year in the Northern Hemisphere. When it rolls around to our next school year, starting in February 2021, frankly, I think that we'll just be an afterthought. Those restrictions will just still be in place.
But then what about the universities or the educational institutions that the Chinese were frequenting before all this went to ground? What happens to them? Are they going to be around?
Of course, that's our problem, not their problem. The universities can well withstand the financial shock. They don't want to withstand the financial shock, but they can handle it. And the reason they can handle it is that most of this money coming from Chinese students has not been poured into core educational activities. It hasn't been subsidizing people like me who teach mainly local students in arts faculties. This money has been poured straight from the business school bucket, where all the Chinese students are going, into high-profile research initiatives. Unlike universities in the US and UK, which mainly fund big research institutes on private philanthropy, Australian universities have funded their big research initiatives out of current receipts, out of international student revenue. That's why Australian universities have zoomed up the rankings in the last 10 or 12 years. I mean, Australia now has 7 universities in the global top 100 research rankings. Now, that sounds like a great accomplishment until you realize that Australia is a small country of 25 million people. What are we doing with more high-ranked research universities than China, Germany, Japan? We're third after the US and second and third to the UK by only one university. UK has 8 universities in the top 100. We have 7. It's really pathological, and it has developed because we've had this outsized revenue from international, primarily Chinese students for the last 10 or 20 years, and that revenue has been simply poured directly into funding research institutes. Now, I say Australian universities can well survive the crisis because most of those researchers are being hired on term appointments. That is, these are not tenured permanent faculty members. These are people who've been hired for the duration of their research project. Now, I don't want to be hard-hearted. I mean, every job loss is a catastrophe for the person who loses it. But these contracts were funded on this kind of, very soft money coming from current revenues. And I think these jobs are going to have to go.
I can almost hear someone swallowing the glass of $30 Pinot at the moment. What's happening? We're going to
well, I mean, let me put it in perspective. I mean, people like me, the whole rationale for a research university is that people like me are researchers who then turn around and teach in the classroom using what we've learned from our research in our classes. And that's why universities do research. What we've seen in the last 20 years at Australian universities has been a separation of research from teaching, so that we've seen an entire class of people hired purely to do research, mainly in the sciences and in medicine, where they generate large numbers of publications. They don't teach students. They have no interaction with the rest of the university. Their job is essentially just to produce journal articles that then feed the university's rise up the rankings. That is, I think, is an unhealthy development for any university, and we've seen a lot of that here in Australia.
What are your thoughts on the Australia-China trade relations? Is it just a war of words, or do we have, some say, the schoolyard bully beating their chest a bit more than normal?
There definitely is a schoolyard bully, and I think Australians are waking up to the fact that dealing with China is making a deal with the devil. But that said, I don't think that China's threats are as meaningful as everyone makes them out to be. They are talking about warning Chinese students not to come to Australia. Well, no one's coming to Australia anyway at this time. They are talking about scaling back purchases of Australian agricultural products, but they have to scale those back anyway because under the terms of their Phase 1 trade agreement with the United States, they've got to buy hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. agricultural products. So a lot of what they're doing is making a lot of noise over things that are happening anyway. The Australian products they really need, the iron ore, they're still coming here to get.
Have we begun to better manage Chinese foreign investment in our primary industries and resources?
Well, there is now a federal investment review of all foreign investment, and I think it's a bit ridiculous that in order to placate China, that review is placed on all foreign investment, including from the United States and United Kingdom, which is a bit ridiculous that U.S. and U.K. investment in Australia should be subject to review just so that Chinese sensibilities aren't upset. Whether that review is effective, honestly, I don't have details on individual cases. I don't know how effective it has been. At least people are now aware of it. And I think that's really the big issue. It's not that Australia shouldn't deal with China or take Chinese investment. Of course, Australia should be deeply engaged with China. It's that people should be conscious of what they're doing. They should do it with open eyes. They should be aware of the risks involved. And I think Australia is now waking up to those risks, or at least Australia outside of Victoria, which I know we'll talk about.
That's right, the People's Republic of Victoria, led by Chairman Dan. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative, what sort of strings do you think would be attached to the $25 billion Belt and Road Initiative to Victoria?
The offer is financial. The strings are political. China's Belt and Road Initiative is not really an economic integration program. This is something I've studied very closely, and it isn't really benefiting China economically at all. It hasn't redirected trade towards China. It hasn't resulted in profit for Chinese companies. It is, from the Chinese standpoint, a subsidy being given out to compliant countries, or in Victoria's case, states, in exchange for below market financing. And what Victoria is so desperate to get is part of that pot of underpriced Chinese finance. Will the finance be underpriced? It probably will be. Is that worth causing a disruption, a rupture within Australia's domestic federal system? I think probably not. I'm not Australian myself. I am American. I'm only a friendly voice here. It's not my politics. But when a state of a country decides to run its own foreign policy in defiance of the national authorities, I think that's really a recipe for trouble.
It's. I'm just thinking about the states here. I mean, Victoria does. They had this national cabinet with the coronavirus, and they all get together, and it's a bit like out of Monty Python, and they get together. Yes, we'll all agree, and then they go out and do their own stuff. And I was thinking, well, we're not alone here. It happens in the US. So you've got, again, the People's Republic of California. I mean, there's another one. So, do you think democracy, in a way, sort of almost breeds contempt?
No, I'm a big fan of federalism, and I think that the fights between the states and the federal government in the United States, while they have perhaps impeded the coronavirus response in some cases, for example, in New York and California, I think it has enabled states to have better coronavirus responses. For example, in Florida, which everyone thought would have a killer epidemic, but Florida has used its autonomy to really run a first-class public health program, despite the concentration of elderly people, to avoid the worst of the coronavirus epidemic. So I'm a big fan of federalism, but federalism really is something for domestic politics. It's not something that should spill over into foreign affairs. It's frankly a bit ridiculous for states in a federal system to be making deals with foreign countries. It's just, I don't know if it's legal or not in Australia, but it's certainly unseemly.
We had Dave Rubin on last week talking about government, and he, some say we want big government, some say we need small government. He says, no, we actually need good government.
Well, that's certainly true, but I think we get good government from federalism. I mean, the closer politicians are to the voters, the better. And, you won't hear me condemning the fact that, states can go their own way. I mean, I may condemn the way a state goes, and I may not agree with the way a particular, state or local government acts, but that doesn't mean I'm against state and local autonomy. I think state and local autonomy is a good thing. And it's great that, if Victoria wants to go its own way, that we here in New South Wales don't always have to go with it.
What do you think will be a significant legacy of the coronavirus and China's position on the world stage?
It's really been a wake-up call for everybody. In the initial phases of the outbreak, there were a lot of voices, especially coming from academia, saying we need to stand with China, supporting China's response, admiring China's totalitarian lockdowns. But I think people are now waking up to the fact that, that wasn't all it was cracked up to be. There were a lot of problems involved, and that China, through its deceptions, through refusing to share information about the virus, through its politicization of the World Health Organization, that China really has unleashed a killer virus on the world. And you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to realize that China could have and should have cooperated back in, December, January, February, instead of stonewalling. And I think people around the world are now starting to realize that, a fish stinks in Denmark, except it's not Denmark, it's Beijing. And I really don't think China will get as easy a ride in the future as it has in the past.
Yeah, I'm actually really, really quite, not angry, but just shattered that the world that we used to know really is no longer there. It's like living in some B-grade science fiction movie.
And I suspect we'll find out that a lot of that was overreaction. We'll find out what we could have done better, should have done better. But, that's not going to help China. I mean, everyone, when the investigations start rolling in, everyone is going to start realizing that China is the country that made this happen. The virus didn't just start in China. It was, fed in China, spread by China. Chinese policy led to it. Well, I'll give you a concrete example. African countries have no ability to care for people with coronavirus. I mean, many African countries don't even have hospitals in entire states of their countries. Yet, China put strong pressure on Ethiopia, which is the travel hub between China and Africa, to keep flying to China. In fact, Ethiopia is still flying to China. Ethiopian Airlines flew through China throughout the crisis. Now, other African countries lobbied Ethiopia to close down this transport hub through China. But of course, Ethiopia is a major recipient of Belt and Road Initiative funding. China built its entire transit system in Addis Ababa for free. China built a headquarters for the African Union in Addis Ababa. China built a headquarters for the African Centers for Disease Control in Addis Ababa. So now, African countries are waking up to the fact that China, which for years was viewed as, a source of easy cash, well, now they're realizing it's also a source of, death and destruction. And they're starting to condemn people in their own continent who have enabled this and who've been too beholden to China. And we're going to see that story repeated over and over around the world. Who knows, it may even come to Victoria eventually.
Salvatore, thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the Sydney weekend. I'm sure back in Jersey where you're from, it's probably still pretty cool there.
Well, it's a cold, blustery Friday in Sydney, at least by our local standards.
Salvatore, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Brendan Nottle from the Salvos. For 140 years, we've stood with Australians in crisis. Today, as we all rise to the challenge of this heartbreaking time, the Salvos are doing all they can to ease the pain and find a way through for the people hardest hit. You can play a powerful role. If you're able, please go to salvationarmy.org.au and give to the Red Shield Appeal now. Together, we can do this.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.
George Christensen MP is the federal member for Dawson in Queensland and chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth. George, nice to meet you, sort of on the phone.
Yeah, you're looking good, Mike, as am I.
Thank you very much. We both lie through our teeth sometimes. Hey, tell us how your electorate is faring with the virus and the recent economic restrictions.
Well, in the main, there's ups and downs. We've got the resources sector and the agriculture sector, which underpin a lot of the communities throughout my electorate. The electorate of Dawson includes places like Mackay and the Whitsundays, Bowen, the Burdekin, and areas of Townsville as well. But it also includes, as I said, the Whitsundays, and that is a community that's heavily reliant on tourism. It accounts for most jobs within that region. It is, suffering tremendously at the moment. There are people who have thousands of people, in fact, who've lost their jobs in that community, which is huge for the size of that community. And there are people, quite frankly, who've lost their life's work in terms of businesses. It's an area I'm very worried about, an area that is going to struggle to recover. But recover it will, because the Whitsundays has got a lot to offer in terms of its natural beauty. We just need to do a lot for that particular community to get it back on its feet.
Time to get rid of the border restrictions?
Look, my view on it is that they should be gotten rid of when the medical experts, the public health experts, are telling us getting rid of it. I note that the Deputy National Medical Officer has said that he doesn't believe that there's any reason to keep those border restrictions in place. But I would say that the Premier and the state government need to get rid of them when public health officials say to get rid of them, because that's important, but also to get rid of them when there's a need to do it for our local economy. And it's not just the economy. This is people's livelihoods, their life's work, their jobs, which is so meaningful and important to them. So I don't want to set an arbitrary date on when it should reopen, but neither should we have arbitrary dates for it to remain closed. Like the comment the other day that it would remain closed until September is just absolutely stupid. And I don't think anyone would accept that.
A report commissioned by the Cairns Regional Council found the city's economy will have shrunk by $386 million by end of June, with 7,700 jobs lost. Now, using figures from the respected National Institute for Economic and Industry Research, the report paints an even worse picture for the Gold Coast. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've seen some terrible figures that are coming out of the tourism sector. I actually have figures for the Whitsundays, and these are a bit dated now. They're going back to the start of April, so we're now a month and a half down the track, and it's probably worse. But we're looking at something like 2,760 jobs lost. The number of room nights that's been cancelled is almost 29,500. Number of tours and activities that have been cancelled is almost 24,000. And if we look at what the estimated value of cancellations caused directly by the pandemic, we're looking at very close to $130 million just for that community. It's insane numbers. There's been liquidations of some of the booking agencies. This is a serious issue that needs to be addressed by state and federal government about these booking agencies not having reserve funding for businesses, in the event of an issue like this. But there's about $285,000 that's been lost in revenue from one of these booking agencies collapsing that's been taken out of 11 businesses. And there's another one that's holding back funding from about 12 businesses, and it's almost $609,000 that's owing there. So a lot of impact, a lot of heartache, and the more that we keep the borders locked down, I guess that those numbers are going to grow.
The public sector is unscathed, in fact, stronger than ever. This obviously is a private sector shutdown. So are we in danger of slipping down the slippery slope to bigger and bigger government, even under many years of coalition government?
Look, I think that there is a place for government, obviously, in a national or a global crisis, as this is, to step up to the plate. A place for government to, show leadership in a recovery from a crisis like this. But it's got to be done with the private sector. This can't be a case of, government's just going to be the economy or the bulk of the economy from here on in. We've got to obviously put in place the infrastructure investments in key things like new roads, new rail perhaps, dams or water infrastructure, power infrastructure, that sort of thing. But all of that sort of thing, while it provides an immediate stimulus for when it's being constructed, really in the long term is about helping the private sector get back on its feet. We also need to look at the incentivisations through the tax system, or the lack of incentives through the tax system, I should say, and addressing those issues, because it does hamper the private sector from getting going again. Regulation as well. I mean, I couldn't believe this week hearing the stats that the Industry Minister, Karen Andrews, relayed. Apparently, it takes in the time frame that it takes a US business to set up a major project, we're just getting over one of the many hurdles that there are in terms of the regulatory process for projects in Australia. That's one of the things that's holding us back. So these are the things government should be doing. Shouldn't be a government owned recovery. It probably needs to be a government-led recovery, but ensuring that whatever we do is for the private sector to get back into business.
George, you're very much all in for Australia. The website chinainquiry.com.au stands up for our sovereignty and economic independence and against threats from China. Let me play this first of all, if you wouldn't mind.
Australia is at a crossroads. We can keep giving in to China's economic threats, or we can make a stand for our sovereignty. Go to www.chinainquiry.com.au to make a submission to the inquiry and stand up for Australia today.
Authorised G. Christensen, 221 Milton Street, Mackay.
The Australia-China relationship is looking very much like the schoolyard bully that being China chucking a hissy fit and punishing Australia. What more do we need to protect our interests?
Well, look, I think that the fact is, the inquiry you're talking about, just by way of background, is a parliamentary inquiry into diversifying Australia's trade and investment profile, because the issue is China making these threats when we've got so many eggs in that one basket. And really we do. When we have a look at our exports, there's something like 36%, and it's growing, the number of exports that we have directly into China. So we need to disentangle ourselves from China while they are behaving so erratically. They really aren't really a trusted trading partner, because they pull these economic threats all the time. We've had the recent threats and actions against barley and beef, but we've had them in the past against other exports as well. Coal was one of them. There's a long list, and it's not just Australia they do it to. It's a regular practice for China to use their economic power, I guess, to try and dictate what other countries should think, what other countries should do, and what they should say. And that's just wrong. I mean, we're sovereign nations. We're not vassal states of China or anyone else for that matter. So the only way we fix this is by disentangling ourselves from the dragon. And that means we're going to have to be a lot more self-sufficient, particularly when it comes to manufacturing of key national products that are needed here, medical supplies, for instance. And we're also going to have to look to new markets. And to that end, I'm very pleased that Scott Morrison has looked towards India, because it is very much a growth partner and they have a lot in common with Australians.
Now, you're chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth. What's the committee presently looking at?
Well, so we've got one inquiry that's almost wrapped up, and that was looking at regulatory barriers to growth in exports and investment. We're almost at the point of tabling a report on that and some recommendations to government that will make it easier for people to export in this country across a range of industries. So hopefully that's going to help us post this pandemic, because we need to get going again in terms of our export. As the Prime Minister said, we're a great trading nation, but we don't trade away our values, and that's why our next inquiry, which I just referred to before, the inquiry into diversifying Australia's trade and investment platform or investment priorities, is a very good inquiry for this point in time. We need to ensure we don't have all of those eggs in the China basket, which has proven so volatile, so unreliable, and so untrustworthy in terms of what they're doing with our exports. So we need to spread our risk right across the world, and in terms of investment, do more at home, as I said, and that's what our inquiry is looking at. People can put submissions into that inquiry right now. I'm dubbing it the China inquiry, but it's really the inquiry into diversification of Australia's trade and investment profile. And you can either Google Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth and click around on Google to find it. You can email submissions to jsctig@aph.gov.au, or you can go to my website, which you've talked about before, chinainquiry.com.au, and there's the ability to send submissions through that as well.
What are your thoughts on the Victorian Government, or the People's Republic of Victoria, and the position on China, the Belt and Road Initiative, and whether states should be able to pursue secret agreements that may not be in the long-term interest of citizens and at odds with the federal position?
Yeah, well, look, it's very alarming and very disturbing that a state government would seek to enter into what is essentially a really, really complicated trade agreement with a foreign national government, and particularly one that has the aims, ambitions and goals such as the authoritarian regime in China has. What we know is that they are using this Belt and Road Initiative to create vassal states. They supply a whole heap of Chinese debt-financed infrastructure into areas, which seems all well and good, and they're doing this right throughout the world, particularly in the developing world. And at the point in which countries can't afford to service the debt, then China comes in and demands stuff, demands control, not only of the assets that they have in place, but more because they can't meet the interest requirements. So Victoria's got itself into a very, very sticky situation with this, and it poses a risk for all Australians.
Interesting times, to say the least, and I'm waiting for another comment either from China or from Victoria to say something against the federal government. It's pretty. It's very bizarre. You have to agree.
Yeah, look, it is bizarre, and Chairman Dan Andrews down there obviously is extremely pally with the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, his treasurer came out the other day in this whole situation where really Australia has done nothing wrong. I mean, we advocated for a global inquiry into the cause and origin of this COVID-19 coronavirus. The rest of the world supported us on that. In the end, China supported us on that. But for that, as most people can see, China is reacting like the bully that it is, and trying to blow up our barley exports, blow up our beef exports, and they're rattling the sabre on iron ore and on coal and other things as well, seafood and milk and other. It remains to be seen whether they do anything else, right? Because what they've done here is that they've had long-standing disputes around both beef and barley. They've simply plucked those disputes off the shelf and enacted some restrictions on those two products. And they're arguing they've done it by the book. Well, that remains to be seen. We test that in the World Trade Organization, which we will. If they do anything else, though, without going through the proper processes, then it actually would be a trade war. So I sincerely doubt that there is going to be other actions, because China doesn't want that. At the point in which China does that, it signals really to the rest of the world that they are now playing completely and utterly outside of the rules without any care. And, the rest of the world's already of the mind that they've got to start shifting away from China. That would be the final nail in the coffin for them, I think.
Can't wait till next week to see what happens. Maybe I won't come out of the office. I'll just close the blinds, and it's all looking a bit. I mean, they're saying today that that iron ore and coal is next on the hit list, and that Russia look like they might have some of those materials that they require. And who can tell?
Well, in my area, coal is obviously a really big thing. But I got to tell you that I don't see that there's going to be a huge issue when it comes to those coal exports, and I'll tell you why. The biggest issue right now for coal, and probably for iron ore is definitely something that China needs. I doubt that they'll be able to stop buying it from us, because we are the main supplier in the world of it, and China desperately needs it. So that sort of we'd probably punish them more if we stopped sending it to them. But with coal, they can get it from anywhere, right? From Russia, as they've said. The issue at the moment is that most of the world has slowed down because of the pandemic, and so demand has gone down for coal. In the coming weeks and months, there's going to be a ramp up in economic activity again as the world reopens. Governments are going to be bringing in economic stimulus projects right across the globe, and this will be in the form of building new infrastructure, which will require more steel, it'll require more energy. And that means that Australia is well and truly primed, being an exporter of both thermal and metallurgical coal. So China might seek to buy its coal from, they're only talking thermal coal at the moment, but it might seek to buy that thermal coal from Russia. That'll simply displace a need somewhere else that Australia can replace. Now, just also on the issue of coal, China isn't our biggest customer when it comes to thermal coal. Actually, Japan is. And the biggest customer, I'm led to believe, and it's grown really exponentially and still growing, of metallurgical coal is India. And India is a market to watch. I reckon that we're going to see China dwindle and India take off, and Australia is well primed to have great advantage in that market.
Well, who knows if we can give them a walloping over Christmas and cricket. And get them as one of our most valued customers. I mean, everybody wins except for India in the cricket.
I might have to tell our team to go back a bit, because we don't want to upset them.
Good luck on that one. George Christensen MP, thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and I'll have a glass of red for you sometime in the evening.
Thank you very much.
To keep us all safe and to help our health workers, it's vital to know quickly if you've come in contact with someone who has tested positive for coronavirus. It's why we've introduced the COVID Safe app. With your privacy protected by law, COVID Safe keeps a secure note of other users you've been near if you have to go out. So, if they test positive for coronavirus, you'll be notified. It'll help us stop the spread sooner so we can get back to the things we love. Download COVID Safe today. Authorised by the Chief Medical Officer, Canberra.
You're listening to the Coast Business Radio podcast.
Dr. Malcolm Davis is a senior analyst in defence strategy and capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. His expertise is space policy, space security, strategy and capability development, future warfare and military technology, and Chinese military modernisation. Dr. Davis, welcome.
Many thanks.
Now, the investigation into China and the virus, do you think it will achieve much, or is more likely to come from an alternative US investigation?
Look, I think it's important that we do an independent inquiry into the origin of the virus in China. Everyone understands that it came from China, from the Wuhan area, and most likely it's spread from animals in the wet market there into humans and spread from there. So the basic facts are well understood, but I think it's important that nevertheless we do a thorough and independent inquiry to trace exactly it went from a small-scale outbreak into a global pandemic, and what were the actions of the Chinese government in not being transparent with the international community and not sharing information, so that we have some chance in the future of avoiding a similar occurrence.
What do you think will be the enduring impact of the current diplomatic spat? Is our relationship with China shifting to something different?
Look, I think we are in a situation whereby a lot of key people are starting the relationship after the outbreak of COVID-19, and in particular, we're looking at China in a different sense based on their actions in terms of managing the outbreak and engaging with the international community, and also their role in shaping the World Health Organization's response to the virus. So I think that we are looking at them through a different lens, and their response to our leadership in calling for the inquiry through imposing trade tariffs, through what people are now calling wolf warrior diplomacy, which is very aggressive against us, is, I think, showing them in a different light. And that's generating a lot of debate within the strategic policy community between those who are saying, look, we need a complete reset and rethink about the relationship and not be so dependent on China, versus those who say, look, we can't rock the boat, we can't anger China, let's get back to the way it was before. Now, I'm certainly in the former camp. I do think we need a complete reset, and we do need to diversify our trading relations, but it is going to be an interesting debate going forward.
Will it affect our other policies towards China then?
I think that it could affect the entire spectrum of policy engagement with China, everything from trade, tourism, international students, financial relationships, all the way through to defence and national security. And so it really needs a thorough review, not just at the federal level, but also at the state level. And I think that, the whole situation in Victoria with Daniel Andrews moving ahead with an engagement with China on the Belt and Road Initiative is indicative of the sort of problems we're facing now, whereby China is trying to engage us at the state level to weaken the federal resistance to things like the Belt and Road Initiative.
Victoria is locked in critical final stage negotiations with Beijing over investments worth billions of dollars. Now, the deadline for Victoria to sign an investment roadmap which ties the state to the communist giant is just weeks away. Is this something that can be legally pursued by a state against the Commonwealth position in relation to Chinese investment in critical infrastructure? And will any of this investment be regarded as critical, and do we know what it is?
Look, I think that what the federal government needs to do is intervene in this process to ensure that Victoria does not sign deals and make agreements that are harmful to Australia's national security interests. And I think that that's critical, and we need to move fast on that. So there does need to be a greater degree of federal intervention against Victoria to make sure that they don't do things that would be detrimental to Australia's interests.
Is Victoria's participation in such a scheme unprecedented?
It certainly is. Here you have a state signing a deal with a authoritarian foreign power who very clearly has a strategic agenda that is inimical to Australia's interests in many respects, and they're signing deals that are secret, that they're not sharing with either the rest of the Australian nation or with the Victorian people, and that are fairly loosely worded from what I can see, that gives the Chinese government an awful lot of leeway to impose pressure on Victoria to make concessions left, right and centre. So I do think it is unprecedented, and this is why I'm saying that the federal government does need to step in at this point, bring a halt to the whole thing and impose a thorough review of the deal with basically no hidden agreements. And Daniel Andrews really does need to work with the federal government rather than resisting them and aligning with the Chinese Communist Party.
What's the significance of Taiwan and its relations with the US and other countries, and how China views these other countries' relations with Taiwan?
Well, look, China claims that Taiwan is part of its territory. In fact, the People's Republic of China has never controlled the island of Taiwan. So their claim that Taiwan is part of China is, I think, unjustifiable and illegal. So Taiwan certainly see their future as separate from China. And I think that what you're now starting to see is a greater number of states question what is known as the one country, two systems model, whereby we accept that Taiwan is part of China, but they have a different system to mainland China. I think that Hong Kong showed that one country, two systems is a lie, and therefore we're starting to ask questions about what would happen to the 24 million Taiwanese people were they to be placed under the control of China. I think the situation would be similar to what is happening to the million or so Uyghurs that are in concentration camps in Xinjiang province. And we can't afford to allow the Taiwanese people to suffer a similar fate. So I do think that what you will see is a greater number of states, including Australia, starting to seek closer relationships with Taiwan and distancing themselves from the one country, two systems policy.
How is Taiwan positioning itself at the moment?
Taiwan, I think, is playing a very astute and pragmatic approach. They're saying clearly to China that we don't accept one country, two systems, that we don't accept China's promotion of what's known as the 1992 consensus, which states that any negotiations on integration should be from the basis that Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan does not accept that, and I think that's quite a legitimate stance to take. So what Taiwan is trying to do is resist Chinese coercion. That coercion is occurring through military means, with aggressive patrolling by the PLA around Taiwan. It's also occurring through economic and diplomatic coercion. Taiwan is trying to resist that while strengthening relationships with other states. And I think Taiwan is playing a very sensible and pragmatic approach to very clear Chinese coercion.
China has always played the long game, but do you see the long game becoming shorter, especially with issues such as Taiwan, the South China Sea and Hong Kong?
Look, I think that President Xi will seek to make a decisive move in those areas. They're already starting to put in place a new law in Hong Kong that would give China the ability to go in and simply arrest large numbers of people who challenge China's authority. That's happening as we speak. But certainly options for China in the South China Sea and Taiwan are very clear. China, the current situation emerging out of COVID-19 as a window of opportunity for it to exploit because the US has its attention focused on trying to manage an ongoing pandemic inside the US and the economic damage that that's generating. And there are concerns about US military readiness as well as a result of COVID-19. So the risk is that China will be tempted to exploit that and either move to strengthen its position in the South China Sea or move to increase coercion against Taiwan, potentially by imposing an air and naval blockade to increase that coercion against Taipei.
How will China's stance affect Australian strategic policy then?
Well, look, I think that's the key question. We have to decide just how we respond to China. There is a growing debate within Australia's strategic policy community, of which I'm a member, about how we deal with our relations with China. Some are advocating that we simply accommodate and acquiesce to China's interests and not rock the boat. Others are saying we should push back hard, and certainly I fall into that latter camp. And I think that debate that's occurring within the strategic policy community is indicative of a broader of the Australian government starting to rethink its relationship with China. We obviously want to engage with China in a manner that is not inimical to our national interests or our national security. And so trade is important, but it shouldn't be engagement at any cost. And I think this is the policy that's probably going to emerge, whereby we have a much more careful and pragmatic approach rather than simply giving everything to China in return for the economic investment that they produce here.
Read a really interesting article in the Australian from Michael Evans from the Times, of course, and he writes that America would be defeated in a sea war with China and would struggle to stop an invasion of Taiwan, according to a series of eye-opening war games carried out by the Pentagon. Now, where does this leave Australia?
Well, look, I think that the Evans piece, and I've read it, and I've read a great deal about those war games, I think is spot on. The US does need to address some shortcomings in its military capabilities vis-a-vis China. In particular, its over-reliance on short-range tactical air combat capabilities versus long-range capabilities. The Asia-Pacific region is a vast region, and so short-range fighter aircraft, for example, aren't really that effective in that sort of scenario, particularly when they can only be deployed from aircraft carriers that then have to penetrate deep inside what China has is the A2AD, the anti-access and air denial capabilities. So there is a problem there for the Americans. They have just their military structure to better suit the challenge from China. For Australia, I think we have to do something similar, but obviously on a smaller scale. We have to think about long-range power projection. We have to think about long-range strike, and it has to be able to be done quickly. And I think the second problem that we face is that all our military force structure, all our defence expenditure is based on systems that will take a very long time to appear. So the future submarine, for example, won't appear until 2034. The future frigate, the Hunter-class frigate, won't appear until probably the early 2030s. And so all these key capabilities that we're spending billions on won't be around in the next 10 years when a lot of critical decisions and moves will be made in our region. So I think that that's a flaw in our defence policy, that we haven't emphasised speed of modernisation. And maybe we need to think more about how we can acquire capabilities quickly, a greater integration of unmanned systems rather than relying on these very long-term acquisitions like the future submarine and the future frigate.
COVID-19 has provided a bit of a fog for the rest of the world. Where do you see the next move by China, such as Taiwan, the South China Sea and Hong Kong?
I think that what you will see is the Chinese are due to conduct a large exercise off Hainan Island, which is in the South China Sea, to simulate the retaking of, or the taking of Pratas Island, which is an island in the South China Sea that's held by Taiwan. And this could be indicative of a move by the Chinese to step up coercive pressure against Taipei. And so what I think might happen between now and late 2021 would be a Chinese move to increase coercion against Taiwan and potentially increase their control of the South China Sea, and that could generate a military crisis. I think Hong Kong also is a factor. Once they pass this law, then you could see a much more aggressive stance by the Chinese inside Hong Kong, and it will certainly bring out large demonstrations. And so, I think Hong Kong is set to kick off again in terms of protests and the Chinese response.
And then one wonders what would happen with the United States, because they're not happy with what's possibly going to happen in Hong Kong either.
Well, they're not. There's not a lot they can do about Hong Kong. Obviously they can't intervene there. But I think that if the Chinese were to move in Hong Kong, that would reinforce the perception in Washington, D.C. that China is starting to move aggressively to assert itself around the region, much more so than it has done so in the past. And so the US would respond accordingly to deter and counter, and that would likely see US forces deploying more regularly into areas such as the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits to basically send a strong message to China, look, don't push too hard.
Dr. Malcolm Davis, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Coronavirus is most likely to spread from person to person when we come into close contact with one another. We can all help stop the spread by keeping our distance. This means do not shake hands or exchange physical greetings, and wherever possible, stay at least 1.5 metres away from others. It's also really important to practice good hygiene, especially after being in public places. Together, we can help stop the spread and stay healthy. Visit health.gov.au to learn more. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
You're listening to Coast Business Radio with Mike Ryan.
Daniel Gschwind is the CEO of Queensland Tourism Industry Council, which is Queensland's peak tourism industry body. Daniel represents a Queensland Tourism Industry Council on various committees and advisory boards, including the Tourism Research Advisory Board. He's also a member of Jobs Queensland and is the Deputy Chair of the Australian Tourism Industry Council and Chair of the Australian Tourism Awards. Tourism in Queensland is worth more than $27 billion and sustains 237,000 Queensland jobs across more than 55,000 businesses. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. It's good to be talking to you.
What's the state government risking with tourism and jobs with its stance on keeping the border closed?
Well, Mike, we like to encourage the government to stick with the plan that the Queensland Government released about 2 weeks ago, which mapped out a staged return to business. It is what we had been asking for. The industry, our industry, certainly strongly advocated for that, and we were very pleased when the Premier came out with the currently 3-stage plan. We've seen one stage implemented with some restaurant openings up to 10 people. The second stage, which is the 12th of June, will see some travel restored to within a 250-kilometre radius with, importantly, overnight stays allowed in commercial accommodation. And then stage 3 was or is forecast to mean on the 10th of July that interstate travel all over Queensland will be possible and, importantly, interstate travel also. That is what the government said. And they, of course, also said all of this is subject to the health indicators progressing at a desirable rate. Now, as far as we're concerned, everything is going reasonably well nationally from an infection rate point of view. So we see no reason why the Queensland Government would divert from this plan and keep the borders closed. And we certainly encourage them daily to, as I said, stick to the plan. And so we fully anticipate there is still a real prospect that the borders will open in July.
September, though, is a month that's even longer than September. Is a word that's been thrown around by various bodies. If we don't have the borders lifted until September, and let's face it, Daniel, we're not going to get rid of the virus. It's going to be here until they have a vaccine, and they may never will. So to say that we want to get rid of the virus and stamp it down and crush it, it's not going to happen. So September really is, it's like go into the naughty quarter and don't come out till September. I mean, what are they supposed to do?
No, you're quite right. I mean, I think the idea, we've been asked to help the government flatten the curve. We accepted that. And look, I give full credit to the national, or the federal and the state governments for doing what they've done. We have kept Australia out of the worst case scenario and we are performing exceptionally well. So full credit to them. But we were asked to flatten the curve and we've done that. That curve is flat. If now the goalposts suddenly change and the health officials are telling us that we can't go back to work until there is zero transmission for a month, then we're in real trouble. And I fear, as you say, that will be so far down the track that, in my case, I might die of old age. Go back to work.
And I'll just be behind you. But the thing is, the federal government says you can open the borders. Various states, this is what I find interesting. They have this big cabinet meeting, and it's a bit like a Monty Python skit. They sit there and go, yes, 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 yes. We all agree. They all go out and do their own thing. So federal government saying, open the borders. Queensland government saying, nah, we want to crush it all. I mean, it's not going to happen, is it? And this confusion, this defiance almost from the federal government is really worrying for such a strong industry.
But it's not helpful when these major policy issues, and they are serious issues. I don't want to take away from it. These are serious issues and seriously difficult decisions for governments to make. But when they drift into a political space, that is certainly a worry. And Mike, we were encouraged by this whole process of a national cabinet, and I think they all played nicely together and they achieved some great outcomes. And that's perhaps even a model for other issues to be tackled. So that was a good thing, and we'd like to go back to that without having this political argy-bargy. And as I said, the Queensland Roadmap to Easing Restrictions, which was its official title, is a good document. So let's just calm down and stick with the facts and stick with the plan and allow us, not just tourism, but all of us, to gradually go back to work.
Sounding like a level-headed Swiss person here. And sometimes we actually need level-headedness. What's been done, though, to change the state government stance?
Look, we're engaging as an organisation, the Queensland Tourism Industry Council, and our members individually in some cases. We're engaging with the government on a daily, at least daily basis. I have actually seen the Premier this week. I have written to the Premier. I engage with the Tourism Minister on a very regular basis. And we make our views and our suggestions very clear. We have to be collaborative, and we're trying to be, and we are very collaborative. And I can say we have a very good relationship, our industry, with the Queensland Government, the great Tourism Minister. So, look, there can be no misunderstanding on the government side what our views are. And certainly we are just reflecting what our industry and our members are telling us. And I've had probably never more calls and push for action from members than in the last week or so, and combined with, I have to say, unfortunately, the level of despair and dismay at the prospect of staying closed until September has really rattled the industry. And we transmitted and explained this very, very clearly to the government.
But if they agree in the National Cabinet and the federal government says borders are not necessary, I mean, I don't know what the delay is.
Well, I mean, we're all in the hands, it appears, of health officials, the chief health officers in each state, and that is obviously what's the right way to go. We're certainly when at the height of the risk. I think we have to gradually move to more balanced and multi-opinion strategy now, where we have other issues put on the scales of the decision-making process as well. And as we all know, we have to recognize that this comes at an enormous cost, and certainly not just to the tourism industry, but to all of us. The federal and state governments have been extremely generous and prompt and quick with throwing money about, and that's the only thing that's kept us going in our industry, to be fair. So that's been great. But no amount of government subsidy will substitute in the long run the income that businesses must generate to keep the communities going. There is just no way around that. And just to put it into context, Mike, if we look at the domestic tourism market alone in Queensland, just domestic, not internationally, that will be gone for some time. So the domestic market in Queensland would generate, or last year generated per month, $1.6 billion. $1.6 billion. That's 53 million per day in Queensland from domestic tourism. Now, at the moment, it's round about zero. So no amount of government money, government subsidy, is able to sustain or replace the $53 million every single day. That's just not going to happen. So we need to get business back to work.
Will the sector shrink, leaving just the larger players and the smaller businesses, because we are a small business state. So do we see the bigger ones getting bigger and the smaller ones just disappearing?
Look, I think there will be some structural adjustment, as they euphemistically call it normally, but there will be some players that will disappear. I fear that we're at that point now. You know, it's like a person. You can stop eating for a certain amount of time, and you'll make up for it later. But at some point, it's curtains. You know, so. Some businesses are being pushed to that edge now, I fear. So there will be some adjustment. There will be some businesses that may not close, but they will not have the financial capacity or wherewithal to restart. You know, it's sort of one thing to shut a business down or wind it down, but it's quite another to start it up again. And that is not as easy as flicking a switch. So you need to have your staff back in place. You need to have sort of maintenance and refurbishment actions perhaps in place. You know, your facilities may need adjustment because of the workers' health and safety requirements now. So some businesses will struggle to get going again, and it will certainly take them a long time.
What are the regions that will be hit the hardest? I mean, I would see northern Queensland would be really suffering because it's a long way. It's further than the Gold Coast to drive, or Brisbane to drive or to get to. So it would mostly be, I would imagine, some ships sometimes coming in, but mainly air and road.
Quite right, Mike. That is absolutely correct. You know, in the southeast corner, at least, we've had the benefit or luxury, if you like, of having a large population centre that can kind of create its own party, and so even sort of visit restaurants, and as from the 12th of June, we'll be able to stay overnight within that 250 kilometre radius. But that's not much relief for some of the more remote places. And think of the Outback, think of North Queensland, as you say, the Whitsundays. So it's desperate times. It's really desperate times for them around those places, and they will suffer for a long time. And also to add into this, destinations like tropical North Queensland, Cairns, they had a fairly significant international portion in the tourism mix, and that clearly, as we said, is not likely to be coming back anytime soon.
A real spat with the Chinese government before we go. With the pending trade war, and already they're talking about coal and iron ore next on the hit list. How important is the Chinese market for tourism?
Look, it grew to become the biggest international market for us, and we always looked at that with both, joy, because it obviously kept many businesses and jobs in place here in Australia and in Queensland, but also with a bit of a concern, because when you focus too much on a single market, that brings risks with it. And we've seen that decades ago on the Gold Coast with the Japanese market that boomed and then went very much flat and has never really come back quite to the same extent. So we did learn from that time, and we do have a more balanced portfolio now, but the Chinese market in the international mix is certainly extremely important, or was very important for Queensland and Australia, and I think it will take some time to recover. And again, maybe it will never quite reach the heights in the short term it did before. And the political dispute and rhetoric that's being flung across the South China Sea between the two countries is obviously not helpful. And we know the Chinese government has at its disposal various measures to increase or decrease the passenger traffic out of China into Australia, for instance.
Interesting times. Probably would hate to be in the tourist industry right now, but what can you do? If you're in it, you're in it. So hopefully you don't get swallowed up. September.
We never give up, Mike. We never give up.
No, September, though, is the month we don't want to be looking at for the borders to come down. Daniel Gschwind, the CEO of Queensland Tourism Industry Council, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Hi, it's Brendan Nottle from the Salvos. For 140 years, we've stood with Australians in crisis. Today, as we all rise to the challenge of this heartbreaking time, the Salvos are doing all they can to ease the pain and find a way through for the people hardest hit. You can play a powerful role. If you're able, please go to salvationarmy.org.au and give to the Red Shield Appeal now. Together, we can do this.
You're listening to the Coast Business Radio podcast.
The Epoch Times is one of the largest independent Chinese language news media groups in the world. Founded in the US in 2000 in response to communist repression and censorship in China, they are free from the influence of government, corporations and political parties. The Epoch Times media network currently covers 21 languages and 33 countries. Its global headquarters is in New York City. Daniel Teng is a director of the Epoch Times and has been with the Epoch Times since 2011. He is a regular contributor to the editorial team on China-related issues. Daniel, nice to meet you.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
The Epoch Times has run a very strong editorial to resist the Chinese Communist Party virus, say no to the CCP. It says, amongst other things, that for nearly 40 years, the CCP has used globalization and economic incentives to bring other countries under the Communist Party's influence. CCP infiltration beyond China's borders run deep in the political, economic, cultural and educational spheres. Overt examples of People's Republic of China influence include the Confucius Institute's programs, the Belt and Road Initiative and telecom giant Huawei. By trapping people and governments within its system of economic interest, the Chinese Communist Party leads them to accommodate its atheist ideology, tolerate its tyrannical rule and betray the divine. Now, you're not a fan of the Chinese regime, are you?
Well, I guess at the end of the day, where our mission statement is focused on exposing the truth around the situations involving the Chinese Communist Party. Now, despite nowadays the discourse around Chinese Communist Party is very overt. People talk actively and openly about its use of hostility. But 10 years ago or 20 years ago when we started, this discussion around the communist regime was rather muted. And we put it down to really just, it's that old adage, the love of money is the root of all evil. The communist regime has tremendous economically across companies, businesses, organizations, and countries around the world. But the side effect of that was really that there was very little discussion, and especially when human rights abuses were occurring. So I guess what we're doing is really keen, for all these years, is really keen to just let people know more about what it really is, what it's trying to do around the world. And the series you just highlighted there, to resist the Chinese Communist Party virus, say no to the CCP, is really just the latest in a series of editorial pieces we've put out, targeting and talking about the communist regime.
In a few weeks' time, Victoria is to sign an investment roadmap which ties the state to the communist giant. What are your thoughts on the Victorian government signing onto the Belt and Road Initiative and loans in the billions of dollars?
Yeah, it's certainly a very interesting situation. Like we obviously, the Victorian government will have to make their own decisions and their assessments, but in our experience and our studies on the Belt and Road, it's whenever you do a deal with the Chinese Communist regime, it isn't, there are strings attached. It's not like what Pinocchio says, that there are no strings on me. There are very much strings attached. And there are already existing case studies around the world from countries such as Sri Lanka, Sierra Leone in West Africa, Djibouti in Africa, who have engaged in the Belt and Road with the Chinese regime. And what have they found is that after, at the beginning it sounds really good. The Chinese regime promises funding for major infrastructure projects. But at the end of the day, a lot of these countries end up not being able to pay back the actual funding. And so the project itself reverts to Chinese ownership. Now, the issue with the Belt and Road in Victoria, and it's been criticized as well by federal politicians from both, from Labor and Liberal, is that there's just very little transparency around the actual agreements. And when you look at the agreements Victorian government has signed with China, I think the first agreement is just 4 pages, and the second agreement is 9 pages long, and it's very vague on detail. Points to potentially infrastructure partnerships where the Victorian government may invite Chinese companies to Victoria to bid for certain projects. But it's very, very short on detail, and that is a concern as well because, the Chinese regime isn't doing it really just for fun or just out of their own good graces. They are looking for a long-term relationship, and what that could look like in future is really, I think, is really just a bigger concern.
China has been really aggressive with the rest of the world, notably from our point of view with Australia. Do you see a trade war against Australia?
I think the Morrison government, if I could maybe just start on that point, has been really clear on not mixing the two issues together. So the idea of the trade war is really, I think, was first propagated by mainstream media, and it was the label was actually put on the situation. And what we've noticed over the last week or two is that the Morrison government has been keen on keeping those two issues separate. And from our perspective, it's actually, rightfully so, because it's the communists' tactic to actually muddle the waters and bring in the different issues. So on the one hand, you have investigation for calls for investigating the virus, and on the other hand, you have these tariffs on barley and bans on meat imports. These should be inherently two different issues that should be sorted out separately. But somehow the communist regime has brought these two issues really close together, and the ambassador's comments last week or 2 weeks ago has just muddied the waters a little bit. And it's a common thing that's happened. They did this with the United States when they had the ongoing trade war there, where they would often they would often try to engage for that, and Western governments would try to just keep the issues very separate, and as they should be. Another point we'd like to make about the trade war, if China decides to engage in this sort of tit-for-tat behavior, is we have to look at the communist regime at the moment, especially post-virus. At the moment, the communist regime isn't really in a position to sustain any sort of long-term economic sanctions or economic tensions with major providers or major trade partners. Its consumer spending is weak, and it doesn't have the same amount of money it just doesn't have the economic strength to engage in widespread infrastructure projects that pushed it through the global financial crisis in 2008. This time the situation is much different, and the Chinese regime, although it looks strong on the one, in just at the moment, it's still it is looking to be in a much weaker position than it was, say, 10 years ago.
The Epoch Times, Daniel, has an article about the CCP's virus propaganda, I think by Bowen Zhao, if I got his name right. Can you tell us what's going on here and how they're exploiting various forms of media, including traditional media and social media?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a book that's worth looking into called Unrestricted Warfare. And it was written by two Chinese generals from the People's Liberation Army. And the concept of it was really that rather than engage in traditional warfare with, say, other countries or rivals, the Chinese regime would use unconventional warfare or unrestricted warfare, and that would be the utilization of multiple channels to really, say, defeat a rival nation. And what we're seeing, one strand of that idea is what we're seeing now with the influence being pushed through traditional media and the social media channels that we're seeing. And just in addition to what Bowen wrote, what's not really well known is a major conglomerate called Tencent. It's a digital conglomerate, one of the largest in China. Yeah.
They run Zoom.
And last year they bought 10% of Reddit, the online forum. And it was for some, like $200 million US. And you have to wonder what they're actually doing. What is their interest in buying a 10% stake in an online discussion forum? And so our perspective is, long term, there is a play there to gain access or access to information on users on Reddit. So when you look at it, it's not just on their own social media platforms or through traditional media. It's actually, they've been buying up stakes of digital companies all around the world. Recently, Tencent bought 10% of Afterpay in Melbourne. And you have to wonder, what sort of relationships or what sort of partnerships could be occurring out of that.
Also, the access to private information. I mean, if you're with Afterpay, you've given just about everything that's known about you that's not known about you, and then China knows about you.
Absolutely. And what's also interesting is Afterpay has a very young demographic, millennials. And it's a similar thing with Reddit as well. So it just does seem to be like this digital push also in some ways an outreach to that younger demographic, and which realistically is the future of many countries as well.
It's really interesting. You see the media, and I'm very critical of the media because most of it is from, they're somewhat left, to say the least. And, sometimes you wonder about their research. Not sometimes, most times you wonder about the research. It's Twitter or it's from the social media, Reddit, for example. So all of a sudden they're getting their information not only from their information department for China, they're getting it from which they think are the Western ideas that have been, that have just been mingling out into the stratosphere from everyday Americans or everyday Australians or everyday people. And in fact, it's just another arm of the Chinese propaganda unit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we found when we started the media 20 years ago was a lot of mainstream media was sourcing directly from the Chinese. Well, back then it was called the propaganda department, and it's actually quite a name, isn't it?
That's great.
It really hide its intentions.
You always call it what it is. I mean, that's what it is.
Exactly, and information on a lot of news reports were sourcing statistics, figures from the propaganda department, and regarding issues such as maybe natural disasters, human rights issues, the Sichuan earthquake. So the Sichuan earthquake in 2008, there was a lot of the information that the West was reporting was actually just being sourced directly from the propaganda department, and they definitely had an interest in portraying the rescue efforts around the Sichuan earthquake in a very particular light.
Australia has a good relationship with China so far, and it's been very beneficial to both sides. Should the nature of the relationship change to protect Australia from over-dependence?
Yes, certainly. And we've seen the calls for decoupling from China have been very strong in the past 1 or 2 months, especially in light of the fallout from the virus outbreak and the Chinese ambassador's response to our Prime Minister's calls for an investigation into the origins of the virus. So Australia, obviously, as a media, we just seek to report. However, it's definitely in Australia's interest to stand up for its own values. Now, regarding trade, I think there's one thing to really distinguish is that at the end of the day, we always are at pains to emphasize the difference between Chinese people and the communist regime. And the Chinese people, whether they're in China, around the world, or in Australia, the 1.3 million Chinese living in Australia who identify as having that ethnicity, they're hardworking people and definitely should enjoy the trade benefits. The Chinese communist regime, however, has sort of latched on to that and has really sought to build and to strengthen its hold over the country by leveraging the hard work of the Chinese people. And I think it was Clive Hamilton who said in his book a few years ago that it was only when the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, lifted its foot off the neck of the Chinese people and allowed them some basic economic rights that the Chinese people actually started to lift the country from poverty. And we definitely, and certainly we think that. And actually, it's quite interesting when we talk about the innovation of the Chinese people. I'm of Malaysian Chinese descent, and Malaysia's largest bank, Maybank, was actually founded, when you look back, 100 years ago, was founded by a Chinese person who migrated to Malaysia.
Yeah. Amazing.
And yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking before China is known for playing the long game. Do you think the long game has got a bit shorter of late?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of summarizing it. And if anything, we'd say that the mask has fallen off the facade of the Chinese regime in recent weeks. It hasn't really changed in terms of its values, and you'd only need to dig into the human rights abuses and issues that have happened over the last 20 or 30 years when China's regime was actually growing in prominence and economic strength. Despite the advances in technology, the advances in wealth and wealth generation in China, the human rights abuses, if anything, were getting worse. But they were just becoming more attuned to covering it up and not letting people know what was going on. And advances in technology, artificial intelligence, have also made it a little bit more sophisticated in the ways they've been able to cover up certain issues. At the moment, we're writing about something, well, from an Australian perspective, TikTok. You've heard of TikTok?
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when TikTok is built on, I think they say it's unique in that it's almost built entirely around artificial intelligence, developed from China. Uh-huh. And it's actually got a very, very strong following amongst younger generation Australians. So apparently Generation Alpha, who were born after 2005, I think. They're about 20% of Generation Alpha in Australia are currently using TikTok. And so the Chinese regime, its behavior has never, its true self has never really changed. It's just that it's been using technology to mask and change the way and become more sophisticated in how it's approached its influence campaigns.
Daniel Teng, Director of the Epoch Times, thank you very much.
You're welcome, and hope to see you soon.
I go local because it helps support small businesses.
Anything that's local and accessible is always a thumbs up for us.
I'm all about supporting the underdog. The profit is directly spent back into that community.
Small businesses tend to employ people around the area.
They grow, obviously the community grows here.
When you have small businesses, it creates a friendlier community.
If we don't use them, then they won't be there in the future.
I go local to grow local.
Authorised by the Queensland Government, Brisbane.
You're listening to the Coast Business Radio podcast.
Phil Honeywood is the CEO of the International Education Association of Australia, or the IEAA, which promotes the benefits of international education. Australia's international education industry is a $40 billion industry. Phil was a member of the Victorian State Parliament and Minister for Tertiary Education, Training and Multicultural Affairs and Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Phil, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mike, and good to be on board.
Does the IEAA get involved in marketing Australian education to international markets?
Well, we have Austrade as the official Australian government marketing arm, and each of our universities and many of our private providers of international education do a really good job on their own back marketing. We're just going through a whole new nation brand change, and interestingly enough, that's been led by Rebecca Hall, who, of course, ran the Queensland Government International Education Division. She was replaced by Shannon Willoughby, that many of your listeners would know of, who ran Study Gold Coast. And Rebecca is now the head of international education for Austrade and has been doing a really good job in getting the new brand up and running, ready for a launch at the start of next year. So there's a combination of education providers and government that do the marketing and recruitment, but certainly my peak body, which covers all public universities, TAFE and private providers, including government high schools and independent high schools as well. Certainly we do our bit as well to really promote Australia as a welcoming, safe and world-class study destination.
Australia's international education sector is demanding all other states follow New South Wales' lead and draw up plans to take in new foreign students soon, warning governments who refuse to commit will face serious questions from universities. How dire is the situation right now, Phil?
Obviously, we've taken a massive hit, and it's not just, for your listeners' sake, it's not just the tuition fees that are affecting education providers. And on the Gold Coast in particular, you've got a lot of private English language colleges. I know Richard Brown runs a very good Brown's English Language College on the Gold Coast, and many others. And so what it means is that many of these students come in on tourist visas or working holiday visas, and they might do 12 weeks of English language, but in equal measure they might go to Griffith University or to Queensland TAFE. And of course, those providers are missing out on the tuition fees, but there's also 240,000 Australians that work in the international education industry. And so, for example, many accommodation providers, you've got purpose-built student accommodation facilities, both on campus and off campus. You've got the tourism sector where international students do some domestic tourism. And again, the Gold Coast is very much the beneficiary of some of those 740,000 full fee-paying international students around Australia coming from the southern states to have a holiday on the Gold Coast and further north in Queensland. So really the multiplier effects into the economy of those 740-odd thousand international students are massive. And of course now our borders are closed, we're not getting them to come in on student visas, on working holiday visas, on tourist visas, and therefore many of our, particularly the private providers, but also public unis, are finding a massive revenue hit.
Tell us about our international trade in education services, its value, the most important markets, and their growth in recent years.
Well, I think international education has been sort of a quiet achiever for the national economy. Rather than selling iron ore or coal, what we do is provide education services, and we're very fortunate to have world-class, not just universities, but TAFE and private providers. And those world-class education providers provide qualifications that many of these young people can take anywhere in the world to get a job with. Now, crucially, China is our number one market. 35% of those 740,000 full fee-paying students come out of China. That's followed by India, around 17%, Malaysia, Pakistan. But very interestingly, and particularly for the Gold Coast, we've had Latin American students now in our top 10 student markets. So we've got Brazil at number 5, and we've got Colombia sitting around 8 or 9. It's very interesting that the Brazilians don't come to Melbourne, for example. They go to warmer climates.
They do.
Yeah, and you've got many of them in Queensland and the Gold Coast. But then Melbourne gets the Colombians because apparently the weather around Bogota in Colombia is very similar to Melbourne's. So they're quite at home coming to Melbourne. So you don't get many Colombians in Queensland apparently. So it's just interesting the different motivations. Now, what we find too is that whereas the Chinese students will often come for high fee-paying university programs at Griffith Uni or at University of Queensland, QUT, etc., what we find is that the students from the subcontinent, be it India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, they will often not have the wherewithal to pay $40,000 a year in tuition fees. So they might, for example, do diplomas or might do a degree at a private provider. So there's no one-size-fits-all model, but certainly different students from different countries. So the Latin Americans, for example, they tend to come and do hospitality diplomas and often work as baristas and in your cafes and hotels, and they will get a world-class diploma in hospitality and hotel management and do some English language while they're here in Australia, and then they'll go home and they can still do their bachelor degree or their master's degree free of charge or very low-cost tuition fees, albeit often in their bankrupt economy, back home. So we find that different countries have students who are looking for different types of enrolment in courses, both public and private provider.
Salvatore Babones from the Centre of Independent Studies believe there is a high degree of risk given the huge exposure to the Chinese market. What do you say to that?
I think we often overlook that China is the most populous country in the world, 1.3 billion people. China has a massive appetite for offshore education. Chinese students are the biggest market for the USA universities, for Canada, for UK. So we're not unusual in that regard. And to be honest, other countries like India have got a rising middle class, but because China's had the one-child policy for so long, obviously there's more of often a wherewithal or an ambition to have that one child get a world-class education offshore, whereas for many Indian families, for example, by way of contrast, they might have 5 children and can't justify the investment in one of the 5 children having a high tuition fee paying course over other children. So, yes, we do rely on China, but then look, so does our iron ore industry, so does our coal industry. So we're not unusual there as an industry that's been reliant on China. Despite best efforts for many universities like Griffith, UQ, QUT, and also, of course, the University of Southern Cross and, of course, even the Sunshine Coast University, who have done their best to try and recruit from other countries, particularly in our own region, be it from Vietnam, from Indonesia. But so far it's the Chinese that have got the appetite for study.
Any other new markets on the horizon, maybe just to fill in the blank spaces while the China thing settles down again?
It's very challenging. For example, Serena Russo Group that deliver bachelor degrees for James Cook University in Brisbane, they were told by Austrade, look, come to Africa on an Austrade education fair and try and recruit some African students. And speaking to the CEO, who's highly respected in the industry, Kathleen Newcomb, about how that went for them. Serena Russo Group invested a lot of money in going to Africa to recruit and interviewed individual students there and were able to prove the financial ability of those students to come and study from fairly high wealth families, only to discover that they got 0 visas approved from our Home Affairs Department. So it's a vexed issue because on the one hand, Austrade, our marketing arm of government, say, here, come to a new market that's opening up through an Austrade recruitment fair, and then our Immigration and Home Affairs Department may not choose to approve those students' visas.
Which sectors of education are likely to be most affected with the borders being blocked, with students not being able to come out to Australia?
Well, we took heart from the Prime Minister, Mike, announcing that international education, we might be able to get students in the country in the third phase of him opening up the borders. And so we're looking around July for that to happen. Unfortunately, though, that will be based on each state and territory government's proposals that they take to National Cabinet, and it will be based on sign-off from each state and territory government's health officials. Now, we need campuses to reopen. The number one criteria is no new international students or returning international students can come back to Australia unless our campuses are teaching face-to-face student cohorts. It's an obvious criteria because you don't want international students coming here and being told, well, congratulations, you've got into Australia, but now you're going to be sitting somewhere in your accommodation, cell block, doing online learning. So the fundamental is campuses have to be open. Number 2, we have to have state governments who take forward a proposal. And at this stage, we haven't had a proposal from Queensland. I understand work is going on behind the scenes. Shannon Willoughby's leading a working party to try and get Queensland behind the idea. And then we've already got some states, such as South Australia, who've come forward with a concrete proposal that details the quarantine arrangements. And then the government federally will decide which countries have contained the virus, relatively speaking, compared to others, so that it might be safe to bring some students in, subject to a whole raft of quarantine measures you can only guess at, including the minimum 14 days quarantine, either in a hotel or a purpose-built student accommodation facility, so that we can ensure there's no COVID-19 cluster that comes into the country. So the long and the short of that is that I don't want to sort of list countries that might be able to get students through, but clearly, if you look at the media, you'll see that countries like South Korea, Taiwan, even China itself are containing the virus relatively well, and maybe some of those countries might qualify to have students come in. But there's a lot of water to go under the bridge yet before we can look to any new cohorts coming in later this year. But we're really pushing hard, Mike, for the February intake, the big one at the start of next year. Keep in mind that our competitors in the Northern Hemisphere, UK, USA, Canada, their main intake date is August. And if you're sitting in their shoes in a university in Europe at the moment, you'd have to wonder whether you're going to have any international students coming through their borders by August.
Very hard to plan such a huge industry, $40 billion in February. Actually, let's go back 1 month, maybe at Christmas. Did you ever think we'd get to this stage where all the planning, because it just doesn't happen over the weekend, that you basically get hold of it and you throw it outside and you have to restart again?
Well, it's quite interesting because when we had the bushfires, particularly down south in Australia, Dan Teng, the Education Minister, who's been very good at promoting international education, Dan Teng phoned me and said, look, what can we do to improve Australia's reputation as a safe study destination country because of the bad image of the bushfires? And so we put together a task force of every state and territory government, all the peak bodies, accommodation providers and so on, and every one of the key federal government departments as well. And our first meeting was about what could we do to mitigate the reputational hit Australia was taking, that the whole of Australia was allegedly on fire. Would you believe there were maps being published in Chinese social media and in America that literally showed Cairns and Toowoomba and so on, all affected by the bushfires, when it's a very, very different situation on the ground. So my task force that I was asked to chair, beavered away for about 2 weeks on the bushfires, and then Minister Teng phoned me and said, look, Phil, do you think you might be able to add this COVID-19 issue to your list of, and of course it's just been furiously peddling ever since on COVID-19, and trying to show that Australia will probably come out having contained the virus relatively well compared to other countries, and therefore we should be seen as a safe, welcoming country for parents to send their children to.
Perception, I would imagine, is such an important part, the perception of us being safe with bushfires. I mean, I could see fires down Burke Street. It's just terrible. But that part was overblown, yet we have COVID-19, this deadly disease, and we're actually regarded as being a very safe place to send your children, except you can't get your children in.
And look, there's no doubt that a lot of Australian, the wider Australian community would be concerned, given all the sacrifices that have been made, if we just suddenly open up the borders to foreign nationals coming in an ad hoc manner. So we're looking to each state and territory government's medical experts in discussions with state premiers and territory chief ministers to say, okay, we think you could have a small number of international full fee paying students come in, hopefully July, August, maybe for trimester in October, to prove up the model of pilot programs before we have a bigger intake, hopefully in Feb next year. But crucially, we'll need to bring them in, Mike, even before February. We'll need to bring them in early January in order for them to be able to do English language preparatory classes. Of course, many of the students that go on to university and TAFE have to prove up their English language ability by doing 10 weeks of English language, whatever, beforehand, either at a private English language college on the Gold Coast or at Griffith University, for example, or Southern Cross University's English language centres.
I always tell my, having lived in the States for a fair bit, they say, what's the main difference between the rest of the world and Australia? And I say that we don't move our lips when we talk. So maybe that could be part of like lip exercises in the English language classes, just so that when they go home, people can understand what they're saying.
Yeah, well, it's a good point. I was a Rotary exchange student for a year in Tokyo, Japan when I was 17, before I came back and went to university in Australia. And I used to tell my Japanese classmates that in Australia we speak perfect English. And when they asked me to explain that, I said, well, we're at the midpoint between American slang and very pompous British English language pronunciation. So I argued that I was proven correct because at the time on the bullet trains right across Japan, the pre-recorded English voice to tell you what station you're coming to or whatever was actually an Australian voice, and the CNN TV station beamed out of Asia and America had a preponderance of Australian journos employed. So I argued, well, there you go. We're seen to be a very understandable form of English language. I didn't tell them it's probably because Australians were willing to take cheaper pay rates from CNN.
That's right. Well, we were. We needed the overseas exposure. We heard that dim sum was actually fantastic in Hong Kong. So no, it's all. I mean, the industry itself is such a strong industry, $40 billion and growing, and we really need that to get back on track. And I suppose.
But more important, Mike, just on that, we worry in our industry about talking about the dollar figure, and that's an ABS figure. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, what we're doing is we're really providing future leaders of our own region, right across the Indo-Pacific, with exposure to the Australian way of life, to the way we go about things, to being, a culturally diverse, inclusive part of the new world. Mm-hmm. And at any one time, you can find a third of the Indonesian or Malaysian cabinet ministers have been educated in Australia already. So that's got to be good for Australia in terms of soft power and diplomacy going forward. And many of these young people, as I discovered in Japan, are taught by rote learning. So you bow to the teacher at the start of the lesson, you take copious notes, you don't dare ask a question, and you bow to the teacher on the way out the door. And in Australia, we've got this wonderful teaching, or they call it a pedagogical advantage, where we do encourage critical thinking, creative learning, working in project-based team groups, when you're studying here. And that's exactly what global employers now want. They want resilient young people who can work in teams from different cultures together. So it's a real dividend that we've got, if you like. We just have to, I guess, communicate the benefits of what we're doing with International Education Australia to the wider community, and educate people like Pauline Hanson that we're not a threat. We're actually a great advantage for Australia going forward.
Phil Honeywood, CEO of the International Education Association of Australia, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
We're talking business, nothing but talk. This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.